Okay, so welcome to today's meeting of the London Assembly Housing Committee. Can I just remind everyone in the room to turn your devices off or put them on silent so that we can have an uninterrupted meeting. Members of the public watching online may like to follow London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag London Housing for this meeting. The main item on the agenda today is our investigation into housing costs and financial health in London and the impacts of the pandemic. But we have some short items of business first. So can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received today from Assembly Member Cooper, for whom Assembly Member Sheikh is substituting.
Thank you very much. And item 2 on the agenda is our declarations of interest. Can we note the lists of offices held by Assembly members in the agenda and also ask if they have any other disclosable pecuniary interests on any items? No, thank you, members. Item 3 is the minutes of the last meeting. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting we held on the 19th of October 2021? Thank you very much, members. Item 4 is our summary list of actions. Can we note the completed, closed and outstanding items arising from previous meetings of the committee?
Noted.
Thank you. Item 5 is action taken under delegated authority. Can we note the action taken by me as chair under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members to agree the Affordable Housing Monitor publication and the letters to the chair of the Justice Committee and the Mayor of London regarding housing for women leaving prison?
Noted.
Thank you very much. And item 6 is the Mayor's response to our Affordable Housing Monitor, which we've already received. Can we note the response from the Mayor of London to our recommendations?
Noted.
Thank you. And here we are. Right, this is our main item of the agenda today, which is our investigation into housing costs and financial health. Now, as part of the investigation, the committee has launched a survey and discussion thread with Londoners to invite them to share their experiences personally with us about how their finances are changing because of the pandemic, how this affects their ability to pay their housing costs specifically. The survey can now be found live on the Talk London site, and the link is on the committee's webpage at london.gov.uk. I very much encourage all Londoners to take part. Our next meeting, today we're hearing from experts, and our next meeting we want to hear more about the experiences of Londoners, and we want to use as many bits of evidence that come directly from Londoners in our investigation, our reports and recommendations. But today we are here to hear evidence from expert guests on the topic. So can I welcome all our guests and thank you for joining us today. We have online Christine Whitehead, who is the Professor of Housing Economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome. And here at City Hall in the Chamber, we have Sian Williams, who is the Director of External Policy at Toynbee Hall. We have Mark Farmer, who is the Operational Manager at the Royal College of Nursing. We've got Baroness Alicia Kennedy, who is the Director of Generation Rent, and Susie Dye, who is the Grants Manager for Trust for London. I know you've all been doing work on these issues that we'll be discussing today. So moving to our main agenda, I will start with a question from me, which is quite an open question. Starting with Professor Whitehead, if that's okay. What do you think the key drivers of housing costs in London are at the moment, and how have they changed throughout the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, one of the things which is most difficult about the current situation is that most data is being collected in a different way from before the pandemic because of the pandemic. So our understanding, for instance, even of the population of London is very unclear. And equally, the material on costs and rents and so on are all being collected often in different ways. So it's very difficult to make comparisons between before and after. I mean, the core issue for many people is that obviously prior to the pandemic, London's housing costs were excessive. They are still excessive. They are over 40% of most people who are in the private rented sector pay that sort of money, and some pay more. What is not clear is the extent to which people left London and stayed left, whether they've come back or the sorts of surveys we did before the mayoral election showed that many people, at least who had just gone to some other part of Britain, were expecting to come back for the election or before the election. What is not clear is how many people went home to mum everywhere else in the world. And the estimates vary enormously from my own colleagues, which is probably the most careful, but maybe being slightly awkward, who says that very few people have actually left, if you take the extent of the whole GLA, while some other analysts are saying that maybe 1 million of your 8 million have gone. So how is this reflected in rents and costs? Well, the first thing, of course, is that some of the government's interventions were helpful, particularly to people in the private rented sector, because we raised the local housing allowance and also the £20 a week universal credit. These both helped people quite a lot, plus the fact that evictions were, both notices and evictions were held up. So people to some extent were significantly more comfortable during the pandemic, but they are going to be now because the universal credit has disappeared, the extra. The LHA is being held down, and it is not clear what's happening in terms of evictions. I have been saying for 1.5 years this is going to be a very long, slow burn, and it's not really yet started because there's still the case that you've got a long wait before you even get to the point where somebody threatens you with an eviction. And I think it will be sort of 2024 before we'll know whether the views of some people that there won't be a major crisis will be proved correct, or the views of other people that we've already got a major crisis is already not correct in the form of that, but it doesn't mean that we haven't got a fundamental difficulty there. Just in terms of rents and availability of private rented accommodation, that is clearly, there was an increase in availability. It has helped, for instance, the boroughs to get better terms for temporary accommodation, etc. So there was a significant decline. London has anyway had slower increases in all types of housing costs, owner-occupied, social, etc., than the rest of the country. So we had a bad situation. It got slightly better if you weren't suffering from other aspects of COVID. don't underestimate those. And it's now getting worse again, and there is evidence of greater tension in the system.
Thank you so much. If I could bring in some of my other guests at this point, and we'll come back to some of those points later on with our further questions and drill more into them. Starting with Sian, if that's okay. Does that tally with what you know, and what do you think is going on, particularly with costs in London at the moment?
Yes, I think so many of those points strike a chord with what we're seeing, and we've got a mixture of working with people directly who are experiencing renting in London through our, for example, our Young Renters project, where we're working directly with private young renters. We've got an amazing event on Friday, which I'll pitch for later. But we also run the Debt-Free London service across London, serving about 25,000 Londoners a year. So we can bring together both people's direct stories and also large data, and everything you've just heard we're seeing. One of the things I think is most telling is the rise in the number of people with rent arrears in our debt advice service. So it's been incrementally increasing. So we've seen, for example, from 2015-16, about 30% of our clients in the London-wide debt advice service had rent arrears. But now it's up to 48%. And although it incrementally increased up until the pandemic, it jumped 14% over the pandemic. And of course, a lot of that doesn't account for the fact, obviously, we've just heard that both furlough and eviction suspensions means that we're going to start seeing, we think, a greater increase in rent arrears. The other thing is that it's not just rent arrears, it's the other costs around housing. So we're seeing utility bills increasing in terms of in terms of arrears, and we're also seeing council tax arrears increasing quite quickly. So the total cost of housing is going up for people compared to their income, which has fallen, and the problems that people are facing in terms of meeting those costs, they're having to juggle quite significant decisions. And of course, through the process where there's been a ban on evictions, they will not have been necessarily prioritising rent every month. And now they'll have to, because as the Section 21 is still in place and ban on evictions is taken away, they'll have to start prioritising those costs or risk eviction. What we'll therefore see, we suspect, is an increase in utility bill arrears because you can get away with that for longer before action is taken. But we also expect to see problems around people not being able to pay for food because they're having to prioritise in the winter heating and also their rent. So that point around we haven't seen the full impact yet is really important. The other thing I think I would draw out is for young private renters, and we've been doing a lot of work with young private renters directly over the last 2 years. And I think the story there is quite hidden because often for young private renters in London, they are multiple people living in a household, sharing a tenancy between them. They might not be related. They're very unlikely to be related. They might not even be friends from before. And throughout the pandemic, what we've seen is that they become responsible for each other in a completely different way. So prior to the pandemic, you sign up to a room in a house with a group of people, and in the contract, it almost certainly says that you have shared liability. I don't think most people understood what that meant, and then the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden, 2 or 3 people in the household, young renters, have lost jobs or lost income. And suddenly, 1 or 2 other people in the household, also young people on low incomes, are suddenly legally responsible for the entire rent of a household. And what we've seen is people helping each other out, but we've also seen them moving out because they simply can't afford it. So we think that young people specifically in those multiple occupancy households are having to kind of think significantly about whether they can afford to live and work in London. And that has a knock-on impact for London in the future. The final point I would say is we're seeing disproportionately high numbers of people from black and minority ethnic communities affected by housing costs and rent arrears. And we're also seeing a high disproportionate number of women coming forward with rent arrears particularly. So we're concerned about the impact on the kind of BAM community, and we're also really concerned about the impact particularly on single parents.
We'll come back to some of those issues later on, but thank you for that overview. Alicia from Generation Rent.
Hi.
If you can sort of briefly say whether that tallies with what you know and what sort of whether this factor that there's, I think the point that we haven't seen the extent of it yet is coming through. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, Chair, thank you. I do very much agree with Sian. I think she's spot on. And in terms of the question, what's driving housing costs, it's many things. I know we're going to go on to talk about it, but the inadequate benefit levels, rising prices, as Sian said, energy, food, the lost income, high rent arrears, and of course rising rents, as Christine referred to. I just want to talk a little bit about rising rents as driving the cost of housing, particularly in London. Initially in the pandemic, we saw that rents fell, but there's now report after report in the media that rents are rising back up to its pre-pandemic levels, with renters returning back to London. They may have well gone away to live with their parents or to stop with friends to save money, but now people are returning to the office and they're coming back to the city. So the cost of renting in London is sent to be 4%, 3.6% higher over the summer than it was in the previous year. That takes the average rent to London to over £2,000, which is a huge amount. And of course, rental supply is lower. There was a report by Spare Room where the ads of rooms wanted outweigh the amount of rooms available. So demand is high. Their inquiries are up something like 165%. But of course, the demand is up, but there isn't the properties available, and we can talk a little bit more about that, Chair, later, I'm sure. And that's pushing rents up. And so Zoopla would say, as they did, I think, last week or the week before, there was a good package on it on the media, that London has a marked 14-year high in rents. And of course, what that means, as Sian said, is we have people priced out of the city, priced out of inner London, in huge rent arrears, the benefits are inadequate, and they're financially vulnerable and at risk of losing their home. And that's on top of the economic effects of the pandemic that are carrying forward. And now with higher rents, you can see how you can get exponentially, this is going to be a huge problem for private renters going forward.
Mark, do you have anything to add to that? We've got some specific questions for you later on, but presumably nurses haven't seen their jobs being lost as much because of the pressures on healthcare. But in terms of rising costs and other issues, what's going on?
Thanks. I think it certainly builds on the report that we published just before the pandemic, the Living in the Red report, which I'm sure we'll come on to.
We will.
And we were very clear in that prior to the pandemic, 57% of respondents were looking to leave London within 5 years, and that was an increase in trend. The pandemic, although we haven't surveyed our members during it, the pandemic won't have made any of that better. Talking to some nurses last night, they were really clear that because of the stress and the pressure of working through the pandemic in London, when they talked to some of their colleagues, what they were seeing was that previously, older staff would look at retire and return packages. So you'd retire and come back and still do some work. That's just not happening anymore. Staff are just simply looking at retiring. So there haven't been probably the job losses, but there's been a big impact on ill health for the nursing workforce. And just to echo one of the comments that Sian made about shared access to housing and people having to share, one of the respondents to the survey we did was really clear on that, and they said, I live in a shared house with my partner. I cannot afford to live alone with my partner. I cannot afford to save a deposit for a house. I cannot afford to have children.
Thank you very much. Susie, to come on to you, the Trust for London publishes an annual London poverty profile, and we've heard from Christine and others about the difficulties of getting data at the moment and people moving in and out of London. How are you doing that this year? And can you tell us a bit, anything you've got in terms of insights of the relationship between housing costs and poverty in London in a general sense?
That's right, thank you. So Trust for London, as you say, publishes London's poverty profile in partnership with WPI Economics. And that's done on a sort of rolling basis of data releases. As colleagues on the panel have said, there's been some issues in terms of lags in the available data and changes in the changes in the databases that have made some of that a bit of a challenge on housing. One of the ways in which we've been glad to be able to supplement that is we have a relationship with a big data unit based at UCL. And so that has enabled a sort of slightly different take. I'm not going to say we've got a full picture, but there are some hints on that. So just at that level of detail for the moment. So colleagues have already said about the rent picture. It's worth saying that while overall rents in London have been, were stable, there's a pattern of falls in inner London, but actually parts of outer London seeing quite significant rises. I guess as people either moving to lower cost areas or some people moving to find more space. So that will put pressure on people. I guess the other thing that we would emphasise is that all was not rosy in the garden before the pandemic, as people will be aware, that housing costs are the major driver between poverty in London being higher than it is in the rest of the country. And that when I look through our data, roughly the number 1 in 4 roughly keeps arising. So just more than 1 in 4 households in London being in poverty before the pandemic. Around 1 in 4 private rented families nationally entered the pandemic with no savings. In 2019, almost a quarter, that 1 in 4 number again, low-income London households faced a cash shortfall, so being unable to meet their bills. That's data from Policy and Practice, based on they have benefits data from, I think, maybe 20 local authorities in London. So, and what we've seen in the pandemic is some indications of earnings falling for people below median incomes, and some people being affected by rent rises, which will have made that more challenging. So I'll stop there.
Okay, well, I'm sure other members will have more questions about that. I'm just going to pass over to Assembly Member Moema now, who's got some more questions about drilling some of those issues.
Thanks. My question is to Alicia. So to what extent are private renters struggling to pay their rent or in arrears following the impact of the pandemic, and what impact is that having on both landlords and tenants?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's any coincidence that the UK government's own research showed that the private renters report has been hardest. They reported that private renters have been hardest hit by the pandemic. And as Susie said, I think renters had no savings or very little savings before the pandemic, and have had to rely on them where they can to take them through the pandemic because of loss of income. So the Resolution Foundation back in October 2020 found that 32% of private renters had lost income in the first months of the pandemic, which of course obviously put pressure on it, which is I think why we found that the rent arrears over the pandemic tripled. And there is lots of good research from all of our organisations that show that in London that has been worse. I think the Citizens Advice figure showed that the percentage in arrears in London was 15%, whereas it was nationally it was only 11%. I'd have to check that. And that, of course, has driven, they're financially vulnerable. They have no savings or very little savings to fall back on. They've lost income. Private renters have therefore been having to claim universal credit for the first time if they've been furloughed or they lost work. And many of them then find that they are then shocked to learn that the benefit therefore doesn't cover the rent that they actually owe. So in London, I've got the figures here, that London claiming universal credit doubled after the start of the pandemic. It went from 119,000 in February 2020 to 239,000 in May 2020, and then rose to 296,000 in May 2021. And of course, we might come on to discuss later, but then there is a gap for many private renters who have the LHA allowance as part of that universal credit, and it doesn't cover the rent, and there's a big gap. So it's more rent arrears, which is... And I know you've written recently to the Secretary of State about evictions, but of course this is driving people living in fear of eviction or actually being evicted because they can no longer pay the rent, and adding to the homeless figures, which of course is an issue for our local authorities. So I hope that answers your question, but there's lots of evidence that show that rent arrears in the pandemic have grown, and this is, more on benefit, inadequate benefits, and driving evictions.
I would really like to hear more about, obviously landlords are part of that ecosystem.
Yeah.
What has been their response?
I think it's mixed. I mean, we did a survey ourselves, and our members and our supporters, 38% of them had asked for support in the rent. However, they hadn't received it. But I want to stress that that's obviously Generation Rent's supporter database by no means is scientific, because I think if you, anecdotally, I do know of landlords that have given rent reductions. If you read research by the National Resident of Landlords Associations, they will obviously indicate that they have been given rent reductions. And of course, you do have a situation where landlords were given mortgage holidays, but of course, yes, renters had the eviction ban, but that isn't really a holiday on your rent. So there are issues, and obviously I'm here to talk about private renters, and our evidence and our survey showed that actually there was a lot more people asking for rent reductions than received it. But I do appreciate that it's a sort of ecosystem whereby if I can't afford the rent and then a landlord's just got one property and they can't afford the mortgage, of course that is an issue for everybody, which is I think why the government have put forward some money for alleviation of rent arrears. It's 65 million. Generation Rent would argue that that's a drop in the ocean, that we don't think that's enough. When we made an estimate of our COVID debt rent relief fund, which was about supporting landlords who are financially vulnerable as well as tenants who are financially vulnerable, we estimated that the cost would be around 288 million, and that was back in, I don't know, at some point in the summer of 2020. So, of course the money is welcome. It just, I don't think, is enough to deal with the scale of the problem.
Okay. And then I just also wanted to know whether you think longer tenancies would provide more financial stability for renters, and that's for the rest of the panel as well.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sure you know, so the government have promised a white paper on the renter reform bill, which is to get rid of Section 21, because just so people are aware that now the pandemic lifelines have come to an end. Renters can be given 2 months' notice to leave their property without reason. That's a Section 21. The government have committed to end that, which is welcome. We're waiting for the legislation. We're hoping the white paper will come very soon in the new year and legislation will follow. But invariably, and we've just recently done some focus group work with renters on this, and by far security of tenure is one of their biggest issues. And there's a number of reasons for that. Not only the financial stability that it might give you, because we're arguing for no in-tenancy rent rises, because you want a period of stability, but it's about the ability to put down roots in a community. And you have to pack up and leave your house in 2 months' notice. What if your kids are at the local school and you've got to move schools? What if you then get priced out of that area that you live, where you work and live, or care for an elderly relative? Because the rents are rising, as we've just talked about, suddenly you might find, as Susie says, you've got to move, if I've been evicted from an inner London borough, I now got to move to an outer London borough to be able to afford the rent. What do I do about the children's school? So the ability to make friendships, build stronger communities, to get involved in that community, even an incentive to vote perhaps, all of that is lost if you haven't got security of tenure. So we very much want to see the government bring in rolling tenancies, open-ended tenancies with flexibility, so that the tenants are able to build a forever home, as one tenant we spoke to talked about it. And that's our next campaign, and we very much hope the government will listen to the wide range of organisations that support that, and we'll get that in this legislation. We hope, with all your support, I'm sure.
I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that, and Dr. Whitehead as well. Yeah.
Could I just ask the quantum? We know that some tenants have received rent reductions. Have you got an idea of the quantum? I couldn't get the the scale of that from your question?
No, we don't have those figures. In Generation Rent, it was only, I think, 7% had actually been given a rent reduction out of our survey, which is normally about 1,000 responses. I can look here. So that's, I appreciate, is our anecdotal evidence and our survey. It's not a national position. And actually, I'd have to check, but I can't think of a national polling figure off the top of my head that had given that sort of information, but I can check that because it may well have been in one of the polls that, you know, we are aggressively can't afford to do many polls, we do our own polls, but obviously Shelter do, and I can check with them because there may well be a figure in that. But our survey showed that actually, though 38% had requested it, only 7% actually received it.
Assemblymember Buff, Professor Whitehead has raised a hand in response to your question.
The national, I mean, we've landlord information because the National Residential Landlords Association has surveyed their members a number of times. Obviously, they are more likely to be in the mainstream rather in the more difficult areas of the private rented sector, but they say about 10% of their members have given some form of rent reduction or holiday. That's not distinct really from Generation Rent because of the mix would be very different. But the honest answer is 90%, they also show that 90% of their members have not lost income as a result of the pandemic. So, sorry, no, I misspeak. 90% of the tenants have paid their rent in full at the right time. But as I say, National Residential Landlords Association is not totality of the system.
So I've got a data point from Resolution Foundation from February 2021, a report called Tackling the UK's Building Arrears Crisis. They stated that, and this was based on survey data sort of nationally, only 3% of private renting families have been able to negotiate a lower rent over the 10 months previously. A further 5% had been refused, and that compared with 1 in 10 families with a mortgage who'd received a mortgage holiday.
Thank you. And my next question is to Sean Williams. Which groups do you think have been most impacted by housing-related debt during the pandemic, and what do you think are the consequences of that debt for those groups? I know you mentioned your young renters group, but I don't know if there are other groups in particular, and within that, a bit more kind of in-depth.
Thank you. So, as mentioned before, one of the fastest growing areas that we're seeing is in black and minority ethnic communities, particularly who are in unpredictable or insecure work, so on zero-hour contracts, in the gig economy, so-called, who are unable to guarantee their income. And we're seeing very fast rises in the rent arrears in that group, in those communities. We think the other impact that's kind of driving that is potentially also the fact that for many of those families, they are part of a wider family network, including potentially overseas. And because the pandemic is global, many of the families here will be supporting families elsewhere. And we've seen a very large rise in the level of remittances being paid overseas to support family members. So we think that for those particular families from very strong communities who have strong support networks, where they suddenly become the supporter or their level of support needs to increase, we're seeing their outgoings go up on a global scale, and then they've got less money to support their local family. So we think that's part of the problem. I think the other kind of, it's not very clear in the data yet, but we're definitely seeing larger families experiencing higher overall costs. So their rent might not have gone up, but their overall cost of living around housing has gone up because they're at home in overcrowded accommodation, trying to work from home or seek jobs from home or apply for benefits from home, or school children at home, all of which has a rising energy cost and a rising data cost. And we've definitely seen all the costs being transferred into the home, where they were probably formerly spread across a range of support services or a range of access. And so we see those costs going up. And then in terms of impact, we're seeing rising food bank use, we're seeing rising utility bill debt, we're seeing rising council tax debt, we're seeing rising rent arrears. So the stress that is placing on families, because at the same time the level of access to services hasn't necessarily increased, because local authorities, government haven't necessarily had either the speed or the money to be able to increase support. One of the things that we're seeing quite significantly is that many people didn't need to seek, for example, debt advice because of the emergency lifelines in place. And now suddenly people are having to think about, well, how do I get access to services? So we expect to see rising mental health challenges, rising food poverty, rising fuel poverty, and rising homelessness.
And just out of interest, does your data is there any insight into the impact on disabled Londoners within that data set? Or I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that.
I don't have good enough quantitative data to talk about it.
Yes.
From our benefits teams, what we're hearing consistently is, particularly through the pandemic, if you already have an access issue because services are not set up for people with particular disabilities, trying to access services become even harder. And so having to think about how many households, how many individuals are out there still who haven't yet accessed the support they need. And as we start to kind of emerge from all the frozenness of the pandemic and we start to have conversations with people, I suspect we'll see significantly greater numbers of people with disability telling us about the trauma they've experienced, and then the cost of trying to put that right and support them is going to be significant.
Chair, can I just add to Sean about disability? Again, there's no data that we have, but anecdotally and through the focus groups and the surveys, you can imagine that if you have a disability and you have to rent privately, it's very hard to find a home that suits all of your needs. And then, of course, once you've found it, you are at the risk of a Section 21 currently. So therefore, you might find this perfect home, maybe at the right price, but then find that within 2 months you might be asked to leave. And so we do have a few cases that have been brought to us that we've tried to help, whereby they're again priced out of the place that they need to live in, that they thought they'd be able to live in for a period of time that suited their needs. So it's very hard for disabled renters to find the accommodation that suits them. And I think that is one of the issues. I think Age UK have been looking at how you encourage landlords to make the adaptations that they need to open the market better to disabled renters, because there's indirect discrimination, because of course our properties in London are not all designed to deal with the level of disability that some people need to accommodate for.
Okay, so moving on to some questions from Assembly Member Sheikh.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And good morning to the panel. Many thanks for joining us. This seems maybe like a slightly odd question following everything that we've heard, but it's obviously to get a holistic picture of what I'd call is the housing crisis, and I'm sure many people would agree with that term, which is, are there groups who have seen their housing situation improve during the pandemic? And this is open to anyone, but maybe I'll start with Christine on this one, and anyone who wants to come in after that would be great.
Well, as I deal with private renters, my answer would be no. I mean, while Sean thinks that, I mean, obviously there will be private renters who have a stable job, stable home, have no problems paying the rent, but we deal with inquiries and campaigns for those hundreds of thousands of renters that aren't in that situation.
Yes.
And so, though the percentages, though we say 9% is in arrears, that's still potentially hundreds and hundreds of thousands of renters that are living on the edge of financial vulnerability and at fear of losing their home. So I don't think that I'd be able to answer your question directly about who was improved. I don't actually think that anyone's improved.
Stamp duty holiday.
Oh, the stamp duty. Well, we think that the stamp duty holiday. We think that was the wrong priority at the wrong time, and actually has added to the problems where we've anecdotally heard that people have been given eviction notices or been asked to move out of their home as private renters because the landlords wanted to sell those properties, as Susie, I think, is alluding to, and that's driven a crisis in itself. Money that could have better well spent in building homes and dealing with the rent arrears to keep a roof over someone's head. But
so I'm sure people will have seen the government went without £6 billion worth of income for the stamp duty holiday, half of which was for properties over £500,000. So I would say high-income homeowners who bought during the pandemic.
Professor Whitehead has raised her hand whilst you were... Yeah.
Shall I take Christine and then
Whenever you want, just letting you know.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was hoping to... Yes, please go for it, Christine.
Sorry, I can't.
Did you have something you wanted to contribute?
Sorry, are you speaking to people aren't here?
Yes.
Okay. High-income homeowners may well have benefited, but on the whole, the suggestion that stamp duty has been a major part of that is not realistic because of the amounts involved, but it is clear that it impacted on how people behaved and saw the market. But in London, as you know, the amounts involved proportionately were tiny, and of course house prices fell in London unlike any other region. So the people who did benefit were people who bought at that time in London. But to go back to the renters, I do think that there were significant numbers of people who benefited as a result of the government policies in the early part of the pandemic. That has now disappeared or nearly disappeared. So the other thing which I think is really important is, to the extent that there is some sort of security, it lies in having an up-to-date AST if you're in the private rented sector. The proportion of people who were renewed during the pandemic was quite small. And this wasn't, I think, because lots of people may have been being nasty, but on the whole, it was simply because the process of the pandemic meant that people didn't actually take very much notice of the fact that it had run out. But the reality is it has run out in a very large number of cases. It could be renewed, and on the evidence across the country, it will be renewed because most landlords want to keep their good tenants. But there is an insecurity and risk there because the proportion who have been renewed is very small.
Thank you, Christine. Mark, did you want to come in?
Thanks. It was just, to say again, you were saying, had anything improved? I don't think it has for our members. There's still over 9,000 vacant nursing posts across London. And just on the sort of stamp duty points prior to the pandemic, there was separate research done that showed that to purchase a property, you'd have to work for 53 years as a nurse to save the deposit.
Yeah.
So the stamp duty holiday won't have done anything to relieve that.
Yeah. If I might move on to my next question, because I think actually, Mark, that leads onto it quite naturally. I had the pleasure of meeting with some of your wonderful staff actually recently to discuss exactly the situation in London for nurses, which is absolutely dire. And I think part of that, as well as what we've heard from the other guests, is the kind of housing conditions being at the crux of, our sort of, poverty, essentially. Our ability to live, our ability to flourish, our ability to put down roots and have stability and grow. So I suppose my next question, and one of the things we discussed actually, Mark, who I met with your lovely team, was talking about getting key workers on the affordable, sort of on the key worker list so that they could access affordable housing. And we passed a motion in the London Assembly. But so many Londoners face so many barriers to being able to have affordable housing or any housing. So that's my question really to the panel, which is, what are the key barriers that prevent Londoners from buying their own home? And how many of these barriers are specific to London?
So maybe I'll start with Sean this time, and please come in as and when you want to contribute.
Inability to save, because current living costs, cost of living, including housing costs when you're renting, are too high to be able to save. The requirements around buying in terms of both deposit and income levels compared to the amount of affordable housing to buy. So the cost of housing is, as we've just heard, significantly higher than people's income allows them to get a mortgage, and very few people are ever going to be in a position of being able to buy a house without, property without a mortgage. I think finally, it's about insecurity. So increasingly people are scared that they can't predict their future income.
Yeah.
And so it's one thing to sign up for a rental property for the next 12 months where you are fairly confident that you can keep your job and pay those costs. But if you are in any kind of employment where you're unsure how long you're going to have that job, and I think what we're seeing particularly with younger people is their belief that they'll ever really have enough income at a high enough level for a long enough time to be safe to buy somewhere. And so their kind of risk avoidance is, I don't want to get into trouble, I don't want to get into debt, I don't want to lose everything. So there's the psychological belief, this isn't for me, I can't do this. There's the getting on the ladder prevention around, I can't manage to save. And then there's the, even if I had enough money, there's nothing out there that would meet my needs, that is affordable, that I can justify spending this amount of high cost and risk on.
Thank you, Sean. I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in, otherwise I have a couple of other follow-up questions.
Just to agree with Sean,
Yeah.
Private renters have very little savings pre-pandemic. I think it's now 60%. I think Sue said at the beginning that private renters have no savings.
Yeah.
Private renters that did have savings had to dip into them more than any other tenures to get them through the pandemic. And of course, how can you save for a mortgage or pass the affordability checks if you've been claiming universal credit or afford to buy the prices of houses in London? So, and also there's figures that show that the expectation of private renters to be able to buy or live in buy their own home are also low and down.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, sometimes rent is more than you would have been paying if you had a mortgage and you'd be doing mortgage payments. And so sort of on that point that you've both raised about inability to save being one of the barriers, I just wanted to follow up with sort of, do you think that greater regulation of the private rented sector would help Londoners to move towards ownership? And would they look, do you think if that was the context, that they would look to buy homes in order to stay in their local area if they had help? So maybe speaking a little bit to what you were saying earlier, Alicia, about putting down roots, having that wider network, the impact that would have positively on mental health. So could I put that back to you both?
Mine would be that longer term tenancies, no in-tenancy rent rises, stability, being able, as Sean said, to predict your income, being able to save, and being able to give that security and get stability in your life, and a little bit more, lower the anxiety and the stress that financial vulnerability brings. So definitely.
Sorry, Christine's raised her hand again in response to your last question as well.
Shall I take Sean and then Christine?
Go for it.
No, I wanted to answer the question before, and I will very quickly, in the sense that the evidence that we and others put forward for the OECD is that young people with savings and capacity and who would do better to be homeowners are often not able to be so because they are in more risky jobs than in the past. So unless you've got a secure job, you have much more difficulty in getting a mortgage, even though that mortgage will be nice and cheap and on average cost 18% of your income instead of 30% you're paying on private renting. Even in London, that means that there are many people who would be able to buy, not easily, but may well not be able to get a mortgage, and the government guarantee scheme is not actually helping that yet. So apologies for going back one question, we'll go forward again.
Can I ask for a bit of clarification there as well, just to be clear? So we heard before that people might not be wanting to take the risk of taking on that much debt. You're also talking about mortgage lenders not allowing them to, is that right?
mortgage lenders and the regulator.
Right. Okay.
The regulator puts in place quite strong treasury management for the mortgage people so that they can't really buy. But I mean, that issue is OECD wide. And, you know, if you are a good graduate in France, the chances that you have a job for more than 6 months is 0, and therefore you can't buy even though you've got lots of money.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, you can carry on now. Sorry.
Not at all. Thank you, Chair. That was really useful. Please go for it, Sham.
So I was going to actually pick up on the mortgage product itself, because I think we're often thinking about supply and cost, but we're not thinking about, if you're buying, that a mortgage is a credit product. It's regulated in a completely different environment to rents. And you know, as Christine's just said, thinking about the limitations on mortgages is really important. And just a bizarre example of how perverse the market around mortgages is that we have a whole group of people called mortgage prisoners who they took out mortgages before affordability regulations came in. And now, under affordability criteria, they can't afford a new mortgage, but their mortgage lenders are allowed to put up their mortgage costs to the standard variable rate. And so they're paying more than if they were able to remortgage, but affordability criteria doesn't let them remortgage, and that's called a mortgage prisoner. So the whole thing is kind of slightly perverse at times.
Yes.
And so when we're thinking about if I'm going to buy, this whole kind of conversation around rents versus mortgages is about time. It's not just about how much money you have. It's about how much money you have over time and your ability to predict, and for the mortgage lenders' affordability criteria to be met, that you can guarantee to meet that over time. Now, in non-secured lending, so not in a mortgage market, for example, where your house is your security, but in other forms of lending, one of the solutions there is a guarantor. And so guarantor mortgages is another approach. But how many people coming from a low-income household have access to a guarantor? So thinking, a particularly young person leaving care, who on earth is going to be their guarantor? So when we're thinking about how can we create a more equal housing market, including buying, I think there's some work there to be done around what does a kind of government guarantor scheme look like, particularly for young people who there is an economic investment in the kind of London and wider national well-being, and yet there's no system to help that.
A government guarantor scheme, that's really interesting. Thank you very much. I have a couple more questions, if that's all right, Chair.
Over time on this section already, so just bear in mind this is going to take away from later time.
Shall I combine them?
If that's all right.
Perfect. So I guess to draw the full circle of this conversation, I was hoping to discuss a little bit about some of the barriers that you've mentioned to buying, what impact that sort of has on the private or social rented sector. And I suppose sort of building on that kind of aspect of social rented, do you think that obviously with social housing, they're protected from the worst aspects of the private rented sector and large rent increases. So do we believe investing in social housing can help improve the financial health of Londoners more broadly by reducing housing costs? So I'm not sure who wants to start with that, but it's another free-for-all. And I know that, Susie, you haven't had a chance to come in for the last couple of questions, but Lisa, your hand's up. So do you want to go and then come in afterwards, Susie? Oh, sorry, that was not a hand up.
No, it wasn't, but...
I mean, the short answer is yes, social housing, building more social housing will help. The social housing that it means that people can have long-term secure tenancies at a rent that they can afford, that allows them to save, that allows them to invest in communities. So it's just a good thing, and it used to be the way that we did things and recognise that people on low incomes need to live in cities like London, so that we have nurses, so that we have mixed and vibrant communities.
Yes.
So yes.
Strong yes from Susie.
Yes.
Good. Great. Thank
Probably
you.
a strong yes from all
It's
of
just
us,
a
I
strong yes
suspect.
from everyone. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, great. Assemblymember Devonish would like to come in on the end.
Yes, Chair, thank you. Just a couple of perhaps more optimistic points I just want to put on record. The first is that overall rent levels in London reportedly fell by 9.4% between mid-2020 and 21. So it's not all bad news. I appreciate it's a hugely challenging market. But my question really for the panel is, with rents going up at the moment, do you think that could be reversed slightly by a lot of housing stock, which at the moment anecdotally has been pulled from the market in London, both because things were going to be sold before lockdown and other properties are being refurbished at the moment. And there's some evidence there's quite a lot of empty homes as well across London. That's got them all silent.
Alicia, earlier on you were talking about the balance of supply and demand in renting, and I was wondering about that as well. What was driving that? Was it people returning to London, or maybe it's more on the supply side because of people doing work?
No, or maybe it's a bit of both, and that needs to be looked into, because as you said, they dropped in the pandemic, but rents are now rising back up, and we can presume that's because people are returning. And yes, why is there 165% increase in inquiries for rented property, which indicates there's a huge demand, an over demand over the supply, and maybe the supply issues is because of the stamp duty holiday, or it's because of holiday lets, or it's because landlords are refurbishing their properties, or they've decided because of the pandemic they may have been burnt and bruised and they've decided they've not got to rent anymore. And of course that's the answer to Assembly Member Sheep's question, which is, of course, building social housing will relieve the pressure on the private rented sector, which has burgeoned over the last 20 years because it homes people who should be in social housing, and also homes people who cannot now afford to get on the housing ladder. Clear. So we have a sector that's expanded to millions and millions of people, which really should be housed in different ways in this country. So I don't have a specific answer to that question. It's all sort of anecdotal and superficial, but obviously we would say rents are up, demand is up, supply seems to be down, we need more houses built, and we need to keep renters in their homes by dealing with the rent arrears and those who are financially vulnerable and at risk of homelessness.
Leave it there, Chair. Thank you.
Sorry, Professor Whitehead also
Christine.
had
Yes, she might have more academic argument.
Go ahead. Yes?
Yeah.
Sorry. Could I ask in this context, I mean, given the very large numbers of Airbnb properties, we have almost no understanding of how many of those went back into the normal private rented sector, and whether they're being held off the market or just let now and again with a lower rental income because they're not being let anything like as much. And I think that's a really important aspect of what the private sector looks like if we wanted to have a thought about, do we really care about the enormous numbers that disappear into short let, although they do to some extent increase the total available.
Okay, thank you. Sian would like to come in, and also I just wondered if anyone doesn't have an idea of, in previous times, the extent of short let homes in London. Obviously there's been flows in and out, but yeah, anyway, Sian, would you like to come in there?
Just thinking about what it's like to be a private landlord right now. We know that private landlords often don't like it when a tenant is on receipt of benefits rather than employment income. We've got many more people in receipt of employment benefits than ever before because of the pandemic, and they don't know what people's jobs and income opportunities are going to look like. So some people will be waiting. Secondly, there's been a significant chipping away at the kind of profit margin for private rents, for private landlords because of tax changes. I'm not suggesting that's a bad thing, only it's going to be affecting people's business models. And finally, with the promise of government legislation, when and how that will be implemented around Section 21, that obviously also impacts landlords' perspective on the control they have over their property. So if you think about it in that way, then if you're a private landlord, it's quite a precarious time to be reletting. And some people would just simply be waiting to see what happens over the next few months, particularly if there's the possibility that they can sell a property or generate short-term income from it in other ways.
Thank you.
And Professor Whitehead, you've got some come back on that as well, I think, some more information.
Sorry, and just on the issue of landlords' preparedness to continue to let, we will be publishing a report on that next week, we hope.
Aha, we will look out for that. We
go.
can use some of that evidence in our final report. Thank you so much. Right, so we've gone over on the first section, unfortunately, but we've covered quite a lot of issues, so hopefully we can make our way through the next section relatively quickly. If we can try and keep this to maybe 20-25 minutes, then we'll have more time to talk about recommendations later. So Assemblymember Baker, you're taking this section.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is to Mark Farmer from RCN. So you've mentioned your report from early 2020. So RCN's report from early 2020 explored the costs of living for London nursing staff, including housing costs. Could you tell us what the key findings were from that report, briefly?
Very much, yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, 55% of respondents were looking to leave London within 5 years. That had increased from work we'd done in 2016, and you would logically assume it's an increasing trend given the pressures that nursing staff across London faced through the pandemic. 84% of members or respondents felt they were much more financially insecure than in previous years. And one of the other key findings, I think, which is worth highlighting, is that from the respondents, 77% of them were the main wage earner in their household. And I don't know really whether that's fully understood or taken on board by policymakers, perhaps by the wider public, that for nursing staff across London, they'll be the main wage earner in their family. And obviously what our survey showed was that it was the twin impact of housing and transport and the costs of those that were prompting staff to consider leaving London. There was a reliance on shared accommodation that we spoke about earlier. And one of the key areas that members wanted to see action on was, and I realise we may come onto it a bit, was around rent controls and measures put in place so that rents were capped so they were affordable, an increase in affordable housing across the board for NHS and social care staff. I think it's important that we don't just focus on the NHS when we've got nursing staff across all areas of care in London. But also a better mechanism for looking at creating housing in surplus NHS estate and keeping it within the provision of the NHS for nursing staff in that area. And those concerns, like I said earlier, they're being exacerbated by what nursing staff have faced in London through the pandemic. Pay awards are below inflation. Realise that's a national issue, not an Assembly issue, but again, for London's members, they'll really be feeling that. And then if you add in the impact and the burden and the burnout that nurses are facing through the pandemic, like I said earlier, nurses that are coming up to retirement aren't looking to retire and return. Nurses coming up to retirement aren't looking at whether they can stay a bit longer, they're looking to leave sooner. So we're seeing the sort of twin impacts of below inflation pay awards and enhanced cost of living in London, and then all the pressures from the pandemic coming together to impact on the quality and safety of care that's delivered, given that we've got a 9,000 plus vacancy rate for nursing staff in the NHS. That doesn't take into account social care and wider care sectors.
Thank you. My follow-up question was actually going to be, through the pandemic, whether you thought there'd be any change in those findings. Is there anything you want to add to that? I know you've sort of touched upon it.
So we haven't surveyed our members during the pandemic. We'd be happy to send some data. We have a member support services team that provide finance and debt relief and housing advice that we can send some data from separately to sort of show the calls and the advice that they've been given. I think that the knock-on effect is the impact on the workforce of the pandemic, the stress that it's put the workforce under. There's been separate research recently from NHS providers where senior service leaders, chief execs and others have spoken about their concerns for the coming winter based on that, the burnout, the emotional pressures, and their very real concern that it's the workforce and lack of workforce that's going to drive those concerns on quality of care and lack of safety.
So you'll have data from pre-pandemic, obviously, about your advice services and the level to which advice. So that, I think that would probably be information that would be really,
make sure to get
really
that.
helpful. Thank you. You've mentioned. Just want to explore briefly where houses are, where homes are. The location of homes, because you spoke about transport costs as well. Obviously, we need key workers to be able to get to their place of work. So your research has found that nurses are experiencing longer commutes as they move out and have to still travel into places of work in London. So what impact is that interaction of housing costs and transport costs having?
I suppose if you, as you said, if people are travelling further before and after work, the impact then on a 12-hour shift when you've probably not had a break anyway just drives into this desire to leave London. So there needs to be increased provision nearer the workplace. That's great both for day-to-day work, but also for the sort of emergency preparedness and response when if you need staff in a hurry, if you need staff doing extra work, they're nearby and can attend as necessary. We can send you the sort of full data breakdown, but we looked at where our members lived and worked, and those commute times were getting longer. So it builds again on that burden and tiredness that our members report. But there was also a lack of awareness from members over what support they can access. So I think that needs to be built into some of the future recommendations around what support there is, how members, how nursing staff can access that. And again, it goes back to that issue of using surplus land, retaining it within the NHS, but building affordable homes for workers.
That's really interesting. That's really, really helpful. So this question again is to Mark, but it may be the rest of the panel have views on this as well. So the Mayor is planning to prioritise intermediate homes for key workers. Does this go far enough in your view in helping key workers who are struggling with housing costs?
I think it's a start. I think it's around a rapid increase in the provision. We still, although there was announcements earlier in the year around nursing and care staff being on the key worker list, that I don't think has been fully finalised yet. Again, it's around ensuring that that's not just the NHS but wider care settings as well. And it's around a degree of transparency of what is available at present and what will be available, and providing we wouldn't want to be drawn necessarily on one type of accommodation or one type of scheme. It's around having mixed models that allow people to stay in London throughout their career. I think Sian, possibly Alicia, spoke earlier about the desire for a forever home. It isn't around just ensuring you've got provision of small flats for nurses in London. It's around mixed models of provision so that you can start your career in London and stay there as your family and career develop.
Anyone else want to come in on that? Key workers and intermediaries.
I agree with Mark, and obviously the percentage of private renters living in overcrowded homes is higher than any other tenure, and of course that's driven presumably partly by the cost of high rent, and as Mark said, the desire to bring your rent costs down because you want to share, or you need to share the rent with some other person. So we find that renters are living in smaller homes, or they're sharing to keep a roof over their head. And as you all know, the common benchmark for a home to be considered affordable should cost you no more than 30% of your income. And in London, the ONS thinks that, or the Housing Resilience Survey thinks that's 38% of the household income West London. So affordability generally is an issue. And of course, that's more acute in the sorts of workers that Mark's referring to. And there's this video, and actually she came back, seen it, and there was a small video, just anecdotally to say the video, there was a video where there was an eviction taking place of a bus driver in Lewisham, and the media covered it, but the conversation he had with the police officer who was empathising with this situation, the police officer said, "I understand, mate, I've had to move out of London because I can't afford to live here." So again, you've got two key workers having a discussion, one being evicted, one trying to deal with the situation, both saying they can't afford to live in the homes that they've got in the city.
If I can supplement that, we tend to focus on affordable rented products, and that's just because actually, as we've been saying, even the affordable products to buy actually tend to be more accessible to those on above average incomes, which aren't necessarily the key workers that we've all got in mind when we're talking about it here. So yeah, I think yeah, everything helps. I think the affordable rented ones are more likely to be within reach of the people that we're talking about. But even so, it can be a struggle.
Baker, Professor Whitehead's got a hand up, sorry.
Oh, I was trying to keep an eye. Obviously, I missed.
Sorry.
And just on intermediate product, yes, the income for shared ownership goes up to £80,000, which is way, way above a single person. It really doesn't work, except in with cases of two incomes. But it's also, of course, the case that it has always been the traditional for people who intend to be in Britain for a long time. But people do move out as they have family or have other things. So there is a normal movement out. The question is whether it's bigger. And we don't know the answer to that, really. But intermediate products don't work as well in London as they do elsewhere.
Thank you.
Boff, were you trying to come in there?
Yes, on there's a couple of points, if I can, come in on there. First of all, I mean, we're talking about intermediate products. Do you think the size mix of those intermediate products is important? Because, who is it that needs those intermediate products? Because the mayor has refused to in any way have any kind of target for family homes. So would you say that there should be something to support families in there?
That's a very good question. I think one of the things which we haven't taken any notice of, partly because it won't happen for a couple of years, is first homes, and that whether first homes can be made to work in London, where people can buy 75% or maybe 70% of their home. And that would be a feasible option in some contexts. But in the main, I don't think that these systems operate very well. But there's it's an interesting question whether there is a constraint on the size of first homes in a mixed development. One sort of assumes that there should be, but I think nobody's really thought about it.
Ms. Williams.
It is the case that intermediate are normally smaller, and it's not ideal.
My main concern is kind of missing the point around the impact of effectively what we're just kind of creating as child poverty. So, a quote. It affects children as they grow up living in our overcrowded house. If they're living in overcrowded housing, I've got a 16-year-old who's doing GCSEs, who shares a room with his 12-year-old sister and his 8-year-old brother, so it's going to affect his ability to study. And if we're thinking about tackling child poverty in London, which of course is a key issue, then tackling poverty absolutely requires a stable and safe home for those children. And if we don't have properties for families on the lower income scale, including in key worker, then we're not going to be able to look after those children psychologically. We're not going to invest in their ability to study, whatever that looks like for them. We're certainly not going to be able to make sure that they go to school well rested. And also in overcrowded housing, we're not looking at parents going to the job market well rested either. So I think these issues are incredibly important. So do we need a mix of housing for people across the whole income scale? Yes. And there are going to be people for whom buying is never going to be an option. And so having more affordable housing in the rental sector, as well as the private sector, so that people have choices. I think the final point is we often miss that when you have to move out of wherever that is, and live somewhere further away, you also don't have access to your support system. So if you are relying on family members or friends or neighbours to provide childcare so that you can go and do those shifts, then you lose access to that. If you are, for example, in a COVID environment and you need to be able to make sure that people can help you so that you can get to work, but someone can still make sure your children are looked after and fed because you can't go back and forth, then I think these are really important points that we're missing.
Thank you very much. And I beg your pardon. Sorry, Ms. Dye.
I think in order for that to emerge, we've got to fix the affordability problem. And that's obviously not something that's within the Mayor's power. But in the context of the benefits cap, where actually I think that the number of families in London affected by the benefits cap more than doubled under COVID. And that just means that if you build those homes, nonetheless, they would still be unfortunately out of the reach of families in terms of being able to pay for them because of being affected by the benefits cap. So the pieces have to fit together. Yes, we need to build the homes for them to live in, but yes, they need to be able to afford them, and that currently sits with national government.
Thank you. And also, the Mayor's yet to complete a list of who is a key worker and who is not a key worker. Has anybody got any bids for what the definition of a key worker should
Mark
be?
did cover that a little bit earlier on.
Oh, well,
Yeah, we were very clear it should be nurses and care workers, but across all settings of care, not just the NHS, so it has to include social care as well.
kind of expected that from yourself, but when are not cleaners, are not low earning cleaners also key workers, especially at a time of pandemic?
I feel like it's not that there's a definitive list, but we during the pandemic we all sort of saw who they were and who were keeping things ticking over, didn't we? And I think that might change over time because as the economy evolves and so on. So,
I thank you for that, because you're quite right. It's a complex thing, because everybody can name a key worker, a nurse, a police officer, a social care worker. That seems to be quite easy. But that list is not doesn't really seem to represent the people who are in those doing that key work. That's what I'm trying to. So I wondered if there was anyone who had a criteria for. I mean, we've had one offered.
I'm not sure we've got the right panel to answer that beyond.
But there's no pictures.
I'm sure we've all got views. I'm sure we've all got views.
Assembly Member Buff, as much as I always enjoy talking about overcrowding, and as much as this is an interesting question, we've got to try and get through the agenda for this meeting. But Sian, I think, did want to say something.
Thank you.
No?
Okay, I'm done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can I wrap up then?
You can do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So just coming back to Mark, just bearing in mind the questions that we were asking, that was asking earlier on, do you think there's anything else the Mayor should be doing?
I think publishing that key worker list.
Could have just waited, Andrew. Would have said
just
that.
waited.
There was talk previously of some cost of living pilots. I'm not clear that they ever really took off. It would be good to see some work done on that. Working with providers to ensure that the NHS estate is used for redevelopment for property, but looking at rent controls and rent caps so that our members can have a degree of financial security.
Thank you very much. I think I'll pass back.
Thank you very much. So moving on to some questions from Assembly Member Devonish to finish this.
I've been told by the Chair to be very quick, so I'm going to ask both my questions and ask you to be very succinct in your answers. And we'll go to the video first, Christine. So my two questions are, which other demographics or groups of Londoners do you think have seen the most significant changes to their household finances and housing costs as a result of the pandemic? And my second question, could you please answer them both at once, what are the consequences of high housing costs for low-income Londoners, please?
Right. Okay, well, the demographics, I think, are the demographics of the employment situation. So hospitality and tourism, all these sorts of areas have been hit very badly. And single people who have been in fairly insecure jobs in hospitality have ended up disproportionately homeless in one way or another, including rough sleeping. So I think, in a sense, the people who've lost their jobs, and also there is a group of people who have lost some of their income from rental. Who are not always particularly rich, who may have done not too well. You may not feel desperately sympathetic to them. That's a different matter. I think the people who, we've already talked a little bit about the demographics of the pandemic in terms of some people did reasonably well out of furlough and therefore have been acceptable. But the post-pandemic is about the security of these jobs and the uncertainties of these jobs. The fact that at the present time there is a massive shortage of hospitality people, etc., is not necessarily getting people into more secure jobs. There seems to be a lot of mobility. So what are the consequences of, well, the consequences are post-pandemic are significantly about, as it always is, the relationship between demand and supply. And we really do not know how many people have come back to London. And we do not know how many people have taken their properties off the market for one reason or another. And there are lots and lots of different reasons. So, there was a period when it was very clear in the last 6 months or so, the 6 months out of the last 9 months, when the rental market was acting a little bit like we'd like it to, with enough properties around and people getting reasonable rent. That is short term anyway, has disappeared. But there's all sorts of things which are going to go on over the next 2 or 3 years which we don't fully understand, like, for instance, student accommodation, which is a very big part of London, and whether students are going to come back to London in the way that it seems to be automatically accepted. I'm not sure they will, and that could produce an additional supply. I do think that the Airbnb, the short-term lettings market, is an area where work could be done. These are properties which can often be privately let for longer terms. So, we're going to come to recommendations, and perhaps we leave it there.
Thank you. Should we go for the panel from left to right, Sian?
I don't think I've got anything to add.
Great, that's excellent.
Okay, me to add, obviously private renters are on low income and on benefits because the benefit doesn't cover the rent, and as Susie said, they're affected by the benefit cap. But in addition, we know that 26% of workers who in the private renters sector worked in hospitality, and of course they were affected over the pandemic, and young adults, 35% more likely to be furloughed. And I think, as Sian said before, ethnic minority communities who, nearly 50% of them reported a loss in income. In terms of consequences, there's ultimately, if you can't pay your rent, Section 21 means you can be evicted. Obviously, there are grounds for eviction on rent arrears, and ultimately you lose your home and you may end up homeless. But there are other consequences, and I think there are 5. There's one that Mark mentioned about that you need to share. So therefore you have all of the issues that Sian raised. So you have to share your living arrangements. Home ownership is out of reach is another consequence. You struggle to afford your essentials to live and heat your home. That causes anxiety and stress. And also that I think there is an issue whereby high rents mean that you have to live in a lower rented accommodation, and therefore quality of the accommodation and living in poor quality and overcrowded conditions can therefore be another consequence of that for a renter.
Thank you. Mark?
Thanks. I wouldn't want to go into too much on the demographics. I think there's others that can respond to that better. I think I would say that from our survey and for our members, those concerns around insecurity and fear over housing concerns and finances exist across the board from both junior to senior staff. In terms of the consequence, I think it's that mixture of individual impact, members like the one I spoke about earlier who, are in a position where they don't think they can start a family because of their concerns over the cost of living, that's abhorrent, right through to increasing that 9,000 vacancy rate. The more that increases, the less safe care that trusts and hospitals are able to deliver.
Susie?
So the one group that we only mentioned briefly is single parents. So at one point, in the winter this year, half of single parents were in receipt of universal credit. It's just a startling statistic, isn't it? And it'd be worth just keeping an eye on that in terms of what the effect of them. Some of that must have been about schools being closed and so on. I guess what are the effects? We've talked about it, but it's also we see in terms of mental health in families, and the impact on children's schooling, you know, falling behind and so on. It's a bit bleak, and so just really welcome efforts from, you know, the London government, and would welcome even more from others to really invest in addressing that.
Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Moema, I think you wanted to come in after this section.
I did, but I feel like you may have covered it.
Okay.
I was going to ask about disabled Londoners, so yes, kind of felt natural to come off at the end, but that's fine.
Okay. I think that's a really interesting question. I know that at the beginning, Professor Whitehead said, you know, there's very little data, and in terms of, it's really interesting that on one hand, Mark, you're saying people are putting off having families, and also Susie, you're saying people who have families are struggling the most. And I wonder if the census may be able to give us some information about that. I know the census is somewhat faulty in lots of ways because of people being in different places and all of that. And I know that the transport data is going to be really poor. But I just wondered if anyone had thoughts on that and whether the census can give us some idea of the people who were gone during the pandemic when the survey was done, and whether or not there's maybe some follow-up work we could do at a London level to work out what sort of happens next to follow up with those people. Does that make sense? Susie, you're the most data-y person.
So I don't have an answer on that, but I can ask my colleagues to follow up in writing if that would be helpful.
Yeah, this idea of people putting off parenthood or maybe even leaving London to do it, and then also this idea that the people who are working in hospitality and tourism particularly, who might have language skills, family abroad, they might just be leaving, and we ought to be able to try and find out that, because like the things that Mark's been mentioning about, you know, vacancy rates in the NHS going up, these are big strategic issues for London's economy, and that's our big remit here, isn't it? So let's try and get some more data on that, and if we don't, we can always make recommendations that more is needed, I think. So moving on to our section, where we want to think about what to recommend is done by government or the mayor, and it is Assembly Member Baker who's starting with this section.
Yes, so this first question is initially to Susie, we think, but then open to everyone. What are your thoughts on the measures introduced by the government during the pandemic to provide additional financial assistance, and how important have these changes been to maintaining housing?
So, the two changes I would mention were the changes to local housing allowance and to the sort of £20 uplift in universal credit. They were welcome. As others have said, they did make a difference. It was a shame that the £20 uplift wasn't applied to legacy benefits as well. That would have benefited disabled people. And it's also a shame that they haven't been sustained. That results in a sort of cut in families' income just while the impacts are still being felt. So and heating bills going up and so on. So.
Yeah. My follow-up was going to be specifically around that, around the freeze to the local housing allowance and the removal of universal credit uplift. So do you think benefits are going to be able to cover housing costs in the near future?
They barely did before, I suspect. It's just going to get worse. Forgive me, I've not quickly located the bit in my notes, but all of the evidence suggests that those who were struggling to make ends meet before, policy and practice are the experts on this in terms of analysing it, that they would be substantially worse off.
If you do find anything particular, then please do feel free to come in. That's no problem. Has anyone else got any views on those measures during the pandemic and how important they were?
Just add to Susie. As you said before, there's so many private renters claiming universal credit now, and for the first time, and then they find that the benefit they receive doesn't cover the rent they owe, and 40% of private renters have a gap between their rent. And I do have here somewhere, but we've done a full report on the gap in every English constituency, I think, in the country, so you can pull out London. There's a specific figure for London gap, but I can't find it, but I shall make sure that you get that report and you can see it was done in 2020, but I think it's still relevant that LHA is inadequate to cover rents across the country, but particularly in London.
That'd be really helpful, thank you. Professor Whitehead?
Yes, I mean, it's obvious that if we're talking about the people who are in trouble, they're in trouble. And if we've kept the LHA down, that is going to make things worse if rents rise. And secondly, the £20 universal credit was a very random way of doing it, and there would be better ways of doing it, but getting rid of it altogether is not the answer. So clearly, our interest today has been almost entirely on the people who can't afford to live in London comfortably and who we need to be in London. But there are, of course, large numbers of people who are helping to keep the rents up because they are able to pay for it. So we shouldn't deal just with the welfare side of the issue, but quite clearly, as I said at the very beginning, people did better during the pandemic for a while, and now they're doing worse again, and that will have consequences.
Thank you. Is anyone else?
Moemi, you wanted to come in, I think, and then I've got
So
Andrew also indicating.
it relates slightly to that, and my question is more about, I appreciate that you deal with people in the private rented sector, so obviously you're not paying a service charge, but for those people, for example, key workers that might live in a leasehold property or be a shared owner, just what your views are, what the implications are of ever-growing issues, fire safety aside, around service charges, and your views on whether or not, or how it would be possible to cap that or make that more controlled, to make sure that that's something that's factored in for those people in that situation, is also a controlled cost. We're seeing that that is something like private rent is beginning to run away from those people that provide those housing products, and I don't know if there's any data out there or things that you can tell us to kind of start a conversation about that as well.
Well, it's not really my area.
It might be
maybe
one for Susie and Christine, I don't know, and perhaps Mark from kind of the employer side. But
well, I think on the service charge issue, I mean, there are some massive issues around what's going on, partly because of cladding. And many people who've bought are in difficulties because of that. For those people coming into the system, if they can afford it, then the rules changing to the housing association bearing a significant proportion of costs over the first 10 years should be helpful. But there are other reasons why it may be very difficult for people to afford it. But the new type of shared ownership, if it does come in with a lower proportion, should allow more people to get onto that ladder, but it will always be that these are not particularly suitable products for London.
The other group I know that monitor service charges are London Tenants Federation.
Mm-hmm.
So they do reports on that, if that's...
okay, great.
Just coming on the bit about information. So I think there's the cost, and then there's what people understand the cost to be. And I think that's part of the problem, because most people don't knowingly go into a situation that they can't afford. Most people are quite risk averse when they're given full disclosure about costs, and will kind of make fairly good decisions. The problem that we have is the lack of clarity, and the lack of disclosure, and then also an understanding of rights. And we see this all through the work that we're doing around housing. Housing is a particularly complex area to understand your rights in any part of the housing sector. And whether it's around what am I expected to pay around service charges, and then what right does the owner and runner of the building have to charge me as an individual, whether it's in leasehold or whether it's shared ownership kind of arrangements. One of the key things that we need to look at is people understanding the contract and understanding the implications of flexibility within those charges. So pinning that down is really important, and also recognising what fair looks like. And fair is not being told one thing and then actually something else happening. And that, I think, is one of the problems that we see. So there is the thing around the actual costs, but there's also about clarity over costs, and tackling that is a really important part of the puzzle.
Thanks.
Somebody with a buff wanted to come in as well.
Question 12 has been actually answered quite fully in previous sessions.
Yeah, so the question was, sorry, to be clear to the members of the panel, we were going to ask about the extent to which rent reductions have been secured, and we've really thoroughly discussed that.
Which we really have done. So
we need to press on to the next question.
This is to Professor Whitehead, and then some of the other people here as well. Professor Whitehead, you published a report assessing rent control regimes in a number of other countries. What lessons can we learn from the international experience, and could rent control work in London?
Whitehead, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry, we're on mute.
I'm aware I'm muted, I apologise. I think that we need to distinguish between rent control and rent stabilisation. Rent stabilisation is a situation where the rent is determined by the market to begin with, but within the tenancy, the rent is linked to a suitable index. Now, of course, looking at a suitable index at the moment is a particularly concerning thing, because that could mean that all these other factors which are making it difficult for you to pay the rent are going up, then the rent might go up as well. But rent stabilisation has worked extremely well in a number of European countries. Rent control is where the rents are held down either at a given point in time or by some other criterion, and do not have a mechanism for increasing, tends to have a longer term effect on supply and to produce lower standards of housing. But what the evidence of the countries that have tried to reintroduce rent controls, because rent controls went out almost entirely, is that they've done it in quite complicated ways, requiring quite a lot of data, and on the whole, in Germany and in Ireland, the tenants have not complained, and therefore they have not actually. There's been a slight reduction in the rate of increase in rents, but not by very much. And we are now seeing pressure in Spain, in Ireland to some extent, in Germany, in Berlin in particular, to introduce tougher regimes, which are on the whole being ruled out. But the most popular way of rent control being introduced at the moment is stress areas, of which most of London would obviously be a stress area, having a mechanism for rent stabilisation rather than necessarily complete control. So the answer is that on the whole, it's not the stabilisation systems, which I think is what the Scottish have significantly brought in, although they haven't necessarily worked it quite right, where you have a market-based rent to begin with, and then a secure situation, is something which many landlords are perfectly happy with, which helps on the supply side, and it removes an awful lot of the tensions from the system. I'm less clear that a rent control ab initio wouldn't have bad effects on supply. I think it probably would, from the international evidence.
Thank you. I was going to ask you about the international evidence, which is, I mean, I can't find a case of where you could argue that rent control worked. Are there examples you've got where rent control has actually achieved its objectives?
In the very short term, rent control can achieve the objectives, but almost inherently, people want accommodation. So if the controls are inverted commas, over tight, then markets find a way around it, and that can be worse standards, it can be paying side payments, it can be paying a rent which is not legal, etc., etc. So in the long term, definitely rent controls do not work. In the short term, there may be some alleviation. But the interesting issue, I think, is that having had deregulation right across everywhere, or almost everywhere, until the 1990s, we are now seeing a revival of interest in rent control simply because the tensions are so bad. I think there must be better ways of dealing with them. And certainly pure, straightforward, old-fashioned first order rent control, you hold the rent down to what it was in 1916 and you keep it there until 1939, does not work.
Yeah, thank you for that. Any other people here said that? Anybody else would like to give? Yes, please.
Thanks for that and the question. And I think that the affordability crisis in London is so out of control that people therefore use the term rent control because they believe rents need to be dealt with and the high rents need to be dealt with. And there are therefore many different models of controlling rents, from rent stabilisation and models of rent control that we need to learn from the international examples. So, for example, limits on restrictions of rent rises within tenancies is about stabilising the rent, and we should look seriously at that, and we hope that the Renters Reform Bill will address that. A form of rent control is popular. 68% of renters in London favour it, and I think Mark touched on that a little bit from his survey. Renters feel that having an outright cap is clear and easy to understand, and they're positive about the cap being being aligned with the quality of the accommodation, so that there isn't a two-tier system. And we do feel that the Mayor and the Assembly could build further evidence to deal with some of the issues that you're raising and that Christine has raised, to see how can we stabilise rents and control rents in London to deliver the key worker support that we need, to lower rents for low-income families so they can build a family, and to show it's sustainable without adverse effects on supply. And that's the piece of work that I know that you're looking towards. And as I say, clear links to quality of accommodation, where that's happened in models in, I think, Denmark, I think it is, that has made a difference to the quality of accommodation and has been quite popular. But when we did our research amongst our panel members, A Generation Rent, there was clear support for some control of rents, and the cap was the easiest model to understand. But as I say, they wanted a link to quality. And there is not just one model, I don't think, that will fix the affordability crisis in London. Clearly, building social homes, as we said earlier, when we all said a universal yes to your question. But in the intermediate action, some form of rent control needs to take place.
I can follow up, Chair. I'm the Chair, sorry. Assembly Member. If I could follow up just on that. Because we know that the Mayor of London has said he wants powers to do rent controls. He doesn't have them yet. And that I think I'm right about this, that once he has more powers, the next thing he will do is set up a rent commission intending to decide on how to operate a model which probably involves a target rent. That's kind of where we're at with that. Which sounds interesting. Are you continuing to talk to the Mayor about, this is a question to Alicia, about these next steps and any timings? I know that Assembly Member Moema asked him about this in Mayor's Question Time. We didn't get much more detail than we already knew from that question, did we?
We haven't for a while, Chair. I'll be honest. In fact, I don't necessarily think that actually we've met. The pandemic and since the last election,
Yeah, and that idea was set out in late 2019, I think.
Yeah. But we have sent them all the research, which has been confirmed receipt, and we're very, very willing to sit down and have written and asked to be part of that commission, or verbally been asked to be part of that commission, and we're very happy to do so, because I feel that we have a network of 40,000 renters across the country. I know we're talking about London here. The majority of those, to be fair, are in London. We have a renters panel who look in depth at this issue, which is what they did with our rent control survey and research. And we can easily get 2,000 renters reply to a survey very quickly. So and we've used that most recently working with the new department on the forthcoming pending renters reform bill, which we're very pleased about the level of engagement that we've had with the department. And we would open that up to all of you and of course the mayor, and we'd want to be part of that conversation, because as I said, you need to look at what are the needs of London, what are the issues in London, and what is the evidence that will allow us to put in a version of rent control for London that works for London and doesn't affect, and is sustainable and doesn't affect supply. And I think I just read yesterday that actually the Welsh Government is similarly looking at this issue, which we hope to engage with them on this. So there may be lessons that we can learn. And actually, Christine mentioned the rent pressure zones in Scotland. Anecdotally,
in Scotland, by the way.
Pardon?
They have not brought them in.
No. When our panel looked at that model, I think the quote was, "It's better than nothing, but it's not really good enough because you have to apply to the council, and obviously you can be net back. So the onus is also on the tenant to report the increase." That wasn't a popular model, and I think that there's much more research that we can do in Scotland to see how that has worked. And anecdotally, I don't think it has. So I'm not necessarily think that's a model that you could take.
Okay, so everyone's got their hands up now, including Christine on the video and 2 Assembly members. And we've got 15 minutes left to talk about all our recommendations. So just to be clear that we can't do that much. I wonder whether, I know the Scottish Government are also looking at a new method of doing this, and also you've mentioned the Welsh Government. Christine's raised her hands, I think, to clarify that when she talked earlier on about stress areas, she wasn't specifically referring to Scotland. Is that correct?
Apologies, Christine.
I think you should recognise that stress areas were first done in Germany and in Ireland. They do operate in those. They have spread to places which are not at all pressured because other people love the idea. It does have a very marginal effect on rents as far as one can tell. But I think the thing which is very difficult, by the way, about international comparisons, obviously, is that the rules are different. So, for instance, in Denmark, you cannot change the tenure of a property. In Britain and in London, you can change it very rapidly. As soon as somebody leaves, you can sell it off. You can do other things with it. You can go into Airbnb. And so London is a very, very, people move a lot. So anything that we do will impact on supply much more quickly than in some of the other examples that we've got.
It seems
That's a really
to be
interesting point. Thank you, Assembly Member Buff.
Sorry.
I'm not sure that Assembly Member didn't have her hand up before you. I'm sorry. Okay, you carry on.
Well, it seems to be that rent controls only apply where you only work where you don't need them, which is effectively what the Professor
Okay, we're not here to
Whitehead
draw
is
those
saying.
kinds of conclusions in the scope of this investigation.
But I would, back in 2015, the London Assembly did a report on rent stabilisation.
Yes.
And the conclusion of that was that there was no form of rent stabilisation that wouldn't actually reduce supply. Because everybody actually wants to solve this problem, but we don't want the solutions to be, on the whole, worse than where we are at the moment. We want the solutions to work. And so has anybody got an idea where we can have rent stabilisation which didn't result in a reduction in supply, which would actually make things worse?
Has anyone actually in this meeting suggested that the stabilisation within tenancies was going to do that?
No.
Well, rent stabilisation or control. I mean, back in 2015, we looked at both forms. We looked at control and
Assembly Member Moema and then Assembly Member Devenish, and then I'm hoping we can come to some recommendations for things the Assembly can do.
Yeah.
So I was actually going to say the opposite. You'll be surprised to hear. I think there are examples and proof of concept in pockets across the capital where landlords, admittedly some of them social, who've moved into the private rented sector, have offered stabilised rents. And so I guess the question is, do you think that's something that is scalable? There are two different things about controlling the rents for tenants so that their lives are manageable in exactly the same way as owner-occupiers enjoy that luxury, and tenants in the social sector also have a control so they can plan for their lives. I think the purpose of this is not to say yes or no to any of those options, but to keep that open mind, but to figure out a way to bring a bit of sense back to the fact that it's completely run away and the situation is at odds with reality for 40% of people in the capital. We cannot have a situation where there is just no control and people are left to the mercy of the market, because people are leaving our capital. And, I love Westminster, but that is a borough which is hollowed out. As Assembly Member Devonish has implied, there are lots of empties in Westminster. I assume that's where you were talking about, because people can't afford to live there. And I think we need to, where we can, retrench from that. Nurses should be able to live in Westminster, but they should be able to live in the private rented sector as well as other places. And I guess my other point is that those people that are homeless, they are living somewhere now, but they cannot afford those places, and yet someone is paying for that. This system is something which that commission, I would love that the committee would be part of that. And I appreciate you looked at it in 2015, but I think times have moved on. To look at what could be the solutions that are specific to the either micro economies that we have in terms of the housing market, but also have a mixture. If a control doesn't work, then it doesn't work. But, that we should look at something which is a solution for those Londoners that are just being pushed into poverty.
Thank you very much. I think, obviously we're not going to come to conclusions here, Assembly Member Boff, but I wonder whether we might consider continuing to explore it, trying to find out where the Mayor is at with this, getting the evidence from Generation Rent that was mentioned, that's been sent to the Mayor, writing to the Welsh and Scottish governments, and just trying to get as much as we can back on the current situation, so that the Assembly as a whole can monitor and push for this work to be progressed and to keep trying. I'm hoping we can do that. Assemblymember Devonish, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, and then we're going to move on to other recommendations.
Well, I'm always brief, Chair, as you know. You are flogging a dead cat here. It's not going to happen. Mr. Khan he's not interested at all in, now he's won his re-election, in this issue. But my more serious point in terms of if Labour Assembly members wanted to push for stabilised rents, there is so much land banking in London by the public sector. We always use the 16 times the size of Hyde Park analogy in terms of the land that TfL alone own, the size of the London Borough of Camden, that is. Could we get the panel to write to Lord Kerslake, who's doing the Kerslake review, to urge the Mayor to release more of this land? And yes, you should build key worker housing on that land. The land is there. It's public sector inertia that's stopping us building.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the Mayor has already launched an inquiry into that, and I think Mark from the Royal College of Nursing has already made that point as well to us, so we'll definitely consider that one. Okay, Sean, you wanted to come in there, and I wanted to also make sure that the panellists were able to feed back to us on clearly their recommendations with regard to things like the changes in welfare, which I know you've all commented on, but if you could let us know what you think about that.
So what I wanted to say was the work that we've been doing with young private renters has been bringing young peer researchers who are young private renters themselves, who've done research across East London with other young private renters, together with landlords, private sector landlords. And they've been doing a series of co-design workshops. And the reason we did that was because too often the two groups are pitted against each other, rather than recognising that they're kind of two parts of a supply and demand relationship. And in good business, suppliers provide something that customers want at a fraud that they're willing to pay. And of course, housing is a different market, but some of those principles can still be thought through. And the young renters who were the participatory researchers were really sceptical about the idea of meeting landlords to talk about ideas, because their experience had been so bad of landlords that they just thought, what's the point? And they came away from those workshops, and we're launching a report on Friday, where they're saying that it was eye-opening to hear what it's like to be a landlord, and that actually it's often as difficult to be a landlord as it is to be a renter, given that landlords, the level of complexity around private renting if you're a small landlord, you've only got 1 or 2 properties, and also the fact that you're often having to work through other agencies. And I think what we haven't talked about in any of this around the private rented sector is letting agencies. And they matter enormously to the equation, because if they do their work well, then we don't end up pushing rents up unnecessarily, and we don't push down standards beyond an acceptable level. And so one of the things that's come out of the work that the young private renters have been doing with the Toynbee Hall research is saying, could we start looking at, for example, ethical letting agencies? Because an ethical letting agency that actually prioritised the needs of renters, not just its return on investment in letting properties for other landlords, would be one of the really important pieces in the puzzle that we're just not even thinking about. So drawing on to recommendations, one of the things that we are really asking for is that both renters and landlords are included in solution making, because there's just too little voice for small landlords to be actually asked what would work for you, given that almost certainly your goal as a small landlord is to have sustainable tenancies with good tenants that you have a good relationship with, because that is what most people want as landlords, plus renters being included in the solutions. So more co-design work, and if you're interested, look at our report that we're launching on Friday, come to the event, listen online to hear how we've been working on that. The second thing is that yes, we need more social housing, but we also need, in the private rented sector, to have an alignment between what people can afford to pay and what is charged. And there are many different models behind that. One of them is creating a London living wage that actually covers the cost of housing. And at the moment, that is absolutely not the case. And so although that's beyond the scope of this committee, one of the important things that the Mayor and the wider committee, the wider Assembly have to think about is how do we create a true London living wage once housing costs have been taken into account. And that is really important. And tackling the fact that most employers in London are still not paying a London living wage, let alone one that takes housing costs into account. And who are the people who are low paid and that we're talking about today? They're the contract services, they're the cleaners, they're the drivers, they're the catering staff, they're the hospitality staff. We're not talking about people who are at the top of organisations here. We're talking about people who are at the bottom of organisations, and that really matters around London living wage. And if we're not going to give a London living wage, we're going to have to carry on topping up benefits because we're not asking employers to pay for people's true work and their costs to work in this capital. The final point would be around, we just don't have enough data. And so we don't know enough about private landlords. We don't know enough about what their true costs are. We don't know enough about how the system works. And small measures like having the landlord register, where every landlord has to be registered, every landlord has to meet quality marks, and every landlord has to report data, would give us all much better insight into where the problems really occur. And then that would allow us to actually innovate together, because renters and landlords, whether they're social landlords or private landlords, they all want actually to have a sustainable business. And at the moment, we're heading towards an increasing level of unsustainability in the sector. We've heard that one of the pandemic kind of influences is that people have broken their thinking about where they have to live and what their options are, and many more people are moving out. So if we care about London as a sustainable place to live, we have to be able to take that on board and innovate so that people who want to stay can stay.
That's really, really helpful, and I think we've seen that from the National Residential Landlords Association during the pandemic. They've been very open about data and made an effort to do that. One of my questions is about what powers the Mayor and London's local authorities could have that would make a difference in all of this. And I think a London-wide landlord register, as you've suggested, is something we should perhaps consider, right, but not debate today, as a way of potentially giving us more data, but also more ability to interact with landlords and ask them more things. That's really useful to know. Right, so yeah, my two questions are basically, do we have enough powers, and what other measures, particularly within sort of the government's and the Mayor's current remit, could be implemented? I think if we focus on the short term rather than like long-term supply issues to do with the market, what would we need to do over the next few months to guard against this growing problem that we discussed at the beginning, where the impact of the pandemic is still playing out, and we don't want there to be essentially slow motion homelessness in as opposed to mass homelessness all at once. Shall I move to you, Licia, and then just go one by one through the rest of the panel before we finish in a few minutes?
I mean, Christine's mentioned holiday lets a long time, and we do feel that there needs to be action to regulate holiday lets and short-term lets, because 1 in 50 properties are listed in London in the early 2020s as short-term and holiday lets, and obviously that does contribute to the shortage of housing supply. And the 90-day limit, obviously on the Airbnb type properties are unenforced, and there is more that I think can do through the planning system in local authorities, and maybe the Assembly and the Mayor working closer with London councils and seeing, because they'll all have these issues and they'll all be discussing them, as they are in many authorities across the country where this is an issue, from Cornwall to North Wales to London. There are clearly best practice that can be shared to regulate and deal with short-term holiday lets. Our other one would be illegal evictions. In 2018, 130 homeless cases were due to illegal evictions, but the police only reported 14 incidents.
Say illegal evictions, you mean that's without proper authority?
Absolutely, a proper illegal eviction where a landlord has harassed or forced the tenant out, which is obviously against the Protection from Eviction Act. So 130 homeless cases were due to that in London, but the police only took up 14 incidents. So there's a problem about enforcement, and for that's about training for the police officers and the call handlers. A Safer Renting report said that too often these cases are dismissed by the police as civil matters because there's a lack of understanding and awareness, when actually they are criminal matters. So we feel that there could be more training, a better recording of data. We all need data to make sure that all incidents between landlords and tenants are recorded in this regard, and there is better cooperation between the councils and the police in terms of prosecution of criminal landlords. And I 100% back the call for a National Register of Landlords, and I think that we're waiting for the white paper from the government to be published. They've consulted on a National Register of Landlords, and they're considering the merits of a National Register of Landlords. So I feel working together with local authorities, the Mayor and the Assembly could put a submission into that white paper in support of a National Register of Landlords and what it would mean for you in London. And that would obviously help to back one of our key national calls, which is for a National Register of Landlords, because it would be so important, as Sian set out. And then similarly, as well as the Renters Reform Bill, and back to something that Assembly Member Emma said about long-term, secure, open-ended tenancies. When Section 21 is abolished, what does it get replaced with? That's a key issue that we're discussing, and we look forward to seeing the white paper from the government, and we'll obviously respond to it. But we need that flexibility and that security for tenants, and we would want to limit rent rises within that to give the rent stabilisation. But that's a whole area that I think that you could engage with, that national debate about what that means for London.
So then that Renters Reform Bill is something we've been expecting.
Yes, for quite a while.
It's not come.
But pandemic per se, but yeah, it was announced obviously by Theresa May back in, I think, 2018, but it was in the Queen's speech. But, it's still on the agenda, and we're looking forward to it next year.
Excellent. So moving on to Mark, you've talked about increasing supply through public land. You also mentioned earlier public sector pay being low. Do you want to comment further on things that your profession and other key workers would want?
So I think in terms of short-term steps that need to be taken by government, absolutely addressing the pay issue and making a pay award that truly addresses both the complexity and need of the profession, but also the cost of living aspects. Obviously, we've got an ask for 12.5% at the moment, and we're balloting our members at this stage. So I think for the Assembly to support that would be a move in the right direction. Further measures, revisit the Vision for London document that spoke about the cost of living pilots, and just see what has or hasn't been done on those. Work locally with bodies such as ourselves, but health systems, to scope out exactly what the need is locally, and look at long-term developments for different mixed models of property provision, and then revisit the rent controls issue. I think there is widespread support for it from a number of bodies, let alone our members, who were very clear that a greater degree of rental security would allow them to consider staying in London, scope out what that means to different groups and how it can be brought in.
Okay, thank you. And then Susie, and then we'll go to Christine to finish up.
Firstly, to echo and support colleagues' excellent recommendations at the high level, at which point I think what I'd add would be to just briefly shine a spotlight on those groups who are worst off in this market. We've spoken about very briefly about disabled Londoners and the lack of data on their housing situation, and could that be something that maybe the Assembly could either, investigate or call for data on, or something, in order so that we get better information on their situation, so that that can then form the basis of seeking to improve it. So disabled Londoners. The second group I would mention is those residual bits of the market. So we've mentioned those who are being pushed into the informal and parts of the market being run by criminal landlords, and obviously within the purview of Metropolitan Police. There's the potential for continued work there along the lines that Safer Renting have highlighted. And then something we've been working on, and we've been glad to see the Mayor respond to the recommendations on this from the London Housing Panel, is those who are being pushed into temporary accommodation. And again, the Mayor starting to use his convening power to bring people together to make sure that those stays are as short, healthy and safe as possible. So that's something we'll be working on. We've been really glad to see the Mayor respond to that.
Okay, that's really helpful, and I think a lot of that is within the powers and abilities of the Mayor and the Assembly to take some action on. So that's really helpful. So finally to Christine, any further recommendations on things we can do to ameliorate the problems that I think you highlighted very clearly at the beginning, that we might be seeing the beginning of a wider problem there?
Right. I think, first of all, the question of agents is enormously important in how the work system works, and it's madness to forget them. Some of them are very good, some of them are absolutely awful. Secondly, the most immediate thing is probably to get back to enforcing standards properly. We've got masses of things which haven't been done during the pandemic, which ought to have been for safety and security reasons, and we have an appalling enforcement process. Registers ought to be much more, even where registers exist, we can't get at them. We've been trying in some cases for 18 months. So I don't think it's rational to try to do something London specific in the way that Berlin is doing trying to do something Berlin specific. I think there has been, at least within the social service, a preparedness to be involved, and I think the extent to which we could get the GLA working with them on issues such as stabilisation. I do not think that we will go any further than, but that does mean getting to a continual lifetime tenancy for those who behave. Finally, it's always worth remembering that pre-pandemic, the social sector kicked more people out than the private sector did. More evictions in the social sector than there were in the private sector, although the section. So it's not just a private rented sector issue. So that was all the short term. The long term we can deal with another time.
Okay, I'm surprised. That's very interesting to throw that in right at the very end of the meeting. I'm surprised about that because local housing allowance.
One in at the end
sorry,
of the meeting.
Assembly Member Buff. I'm surprised to hear that because local housing allowance does cover social rents, doesn't it? But do you want to come in, Assembly Member Buff?
No, I'm just saying at the end of the meeting, I wish that.
He's tickled, basically.
We may write to you.
I just find it
just to clarify on that particular point. Yeah. I think I want to get some clarification. Sorry, Assembly Member Sheikh?
Just generally oohing and ahhing at the last point as well. Just
Yes,
because
okay,
it
good.
sounds-
One thing you did say, so Professor Whitehead, was when you talk about enforcement, you said the process wasn't good. Do you mean that the process needs to be amended, for example, through the Renters Reform Bill, I think that's what it's called, or that there's resource issues? Because I know that a lot of enforcement is done through local councils.
It's part of the issue. I mean, it's an aspect of the whole wish for stabilisation as well, because if you've got stabilisation, then you've got less fear of saying about your problems and making sure that things are done. And I think it's,
Yes.
you know, for all the fact that we've spent most of the time talking about considerable difficulties, and rightly so, you know, 90% of the sector works sort of okay, apart from the fact it's too expensive because of demand and supply.
Yeah.
So trying to get tenants and landlords to work together and trying to make sure that tenants aren't fearful of asking for things is phenomenally important for the totality of the system, not just for the very difficult areas.
That's useful to know. Thank you. Sorry, that is one of the things the Renters Reform Bill is seeking to fix. So, yeah, hopefully. Okay, I think I need to wrap up this because we are 10 minutes of time. So thank you very, very much to our guests for all your contributions today. I know there was probably more you could have said, so we may write to you also with a general open invitation to send us anything else you've got. Can we note the report as a committee and today's discussion, and then delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to discuss recommendations and agree on any output from the discussion? It's very important that we all agree on any output, so we'll have fun discussing that. Thank you very much, members. Item 8 on today's agenda is, can we note our upcoming work programme? Item 9 is the date of the next meeting, and the date of the next meeting of the committee, formal meeting, because we are having a follow-up meeting where we're going to talk to Londoners about these issues today, but we're having a formal meeting next on the 18th of January 2022, 10 a.m. Can we note that? And I have no urgent business, so I can declare the meeting closed. And thank you all once again for a really interesting meeting. Cheers.
Thank you very much, and apologies for being on Zoom.